Well, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome Sarala today, and I hope that if you're not already familiar with her writing, that you will be in a great hurry to read more of it by the time we finish talking here. We'll be putting some links in the chat so you can follow up on anything that interests you. So first of all, let me introduce Sarala. She's a London-based writer, poet and researcher. After All We Have Travelled, her debut full-length poetry collection, was published by Nine Arches Press in January this year and is a Poetry Book Society Spring 2023 recommendation. Her pamphlet Say, published in 2021 by Flipped Eye, was a Poetry School Book of the Year, a finalist of the Primer's Mentorship Scheme and a Fellow of the Ledbury Poet Critics Programme. Her poetry, creative non-fiction and reviews have been widely published in outlets, including the Poetry Review, Wasafiri and The Guardian, and featured on BBC Radio. Sarala is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Liverpool, where she's a recipient of the J.I.C. Davies Studentship, and she lives in London. So Sarala and I first met 10 years ago, at least 10 years ago, in a short story class at Birkbeck, which leads me to my first question, because I remember that the questions you're now exploring, Sarala, in poems, particularly about interracial relationships and marriage, and the cultural tensions that they often inhabit, are very much part of the stories that you were writing then. So I'm curious about how that transition from short stories to poetry came about, and how do you think the writing of short stories informed your development as a poet?
Oh, brilliant questions to start with, Lesley. But first of all, before I get started, I just want to say thank you so much to Red Door Poets for arranging this interview this evening. And thank you, Lesley, and thank you everyone for making this happen. Yes, okay, so we met on the MA at Birkbeck. And I was a prose writer. That was what I was doing. I think I was trying to write novels for forever. So actually, even short stories was already sort of beginning to narrow that down by the time we started on the MA at Birkbeck, the creative writing MA. And I think it was just, I think the narrowing down and the paying attention to every sentence, to every word. You know, I think many of us are writers here in this room. It was the paying attention to, you know, every sentence, every unit that I began to become involved with. And it was that narrowing down, instead of thinking, you know, in terms of grand, you know, big narratives and large projects, I started to really just become fascinated with language. And really paying attention to just what every single word, sound, rhythm can contribute. And that I think that started to take over for me from that interest in narrative, which I think had originally driven me. And then you were talking about the themes. I think the themes have been with me from the beginning. I think I'm one of those poets who is very invested in their work. So I was thinking about this earlier when I was preparing for today. I was just thinking, I'm always so invested in what I'm writing about, because for me, it's self-discovery. It's self-discovery, and it's also figuring out, you know, beyond that, wider society and, you know, how cultures work together and how we all inhabit society. So it's the small questions of language, but also in the personal questions, which then also link out to the wider questions.
It reminded me, I remember Pascal Petit once saying, if you're having trouble with a poem, write into all the corners of it. And that sort of, it came to my mind when you were talking just then. And I was reading a review of something recently in the TLS, I think it was TLS, and the title of the article was Energy in Search of a Subject. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about the creative process, because sometimes I think we have our subject, we know what we want to write about, but we haven't quite found the right energy or the form, you know, to articulate that. And I noticed that quite a few of your poems respond to the work and the words of others. I know you've got a very strong subject of your own, but you're very engaged in a dialogue with the work and words of others as well, I think, which are often incorporated into the poem, aren't they? So I'm kind of thinking about how and where things begin for you when you sit down to write. Is there a kind of pattern to it? Or does a poem find you, or do you go looking for it to begin with a line or an idea or a visual image, or does it come thick and fast and then you have to untangle it all? What's your kind of genre, or is there not a general? Is it multiple?
Yeah, again, because I'm aware we're all writers. Well, so many of us are writers here in this room. We all have our own stories. We all have our own methods. But I think I'm one of those people. I have many routes into a poem or a work of art. But I do say I usually I will often start with an emotion or an idea or a question, something that I really want to get to the bottom of. So I think in the writing of this book, I was really trying to figure out, I had some broader questions that are more philosophical that I might come to in a moment. But personally, I was really interested in looking at my own family history. I was really wanted to explore the dynamics of, interracial and intercultural relationships and what had been the struggles there, and also moments of joy, because actually my grandparents on my paternal side were English and Punjabi, so we've had moments of lots of intercultural and interracial moments which worked out and others that didn't. So it's about the joys as well as the struggles, but in terms of how a poem first comes to me, I think for the book, I definitely had a larger subject that I was writing around, and that had been writing around in different genres for years, and also loss being a big subject for this as well. So I had this need to explore, I suppose, quite an unresolved loss of childhood bereavement, losing my father when I was very young. So it's just all these different modes of exploring the really difficult emotions and the difficult questions in my life, but that also I was seeing in other writers' work, in the work of other writers. And I think the work of other writers frequently provides me with a doorway in. When I see, okay, this is how someone else has approached it, I get immense inspiration from the energy of another poet and the imaginative energy that a poet brings to a subject, or a writer. It can be any genre really, but poetry is really my home now. But then responding to that, like being in a conversation, and when somebody starts a conversation, it welcomes you in, and you're like, okay, there's room in this home to speak about these subjects, which we don't always speak about in everyday life.
That might be a really nice point for us to hear one of your poems. Would you be happy to express at this stage? That would be great.
That does lead very nicely to the first poem I wanted to read for us today, which is called Grandfather Speaks via audio recording. And I thought I'd read this one because it is the poem which contains the phrase which became the collection's title. But also because it's a poem which explores one of the primary themes of the book, which is an attempt to come to terms with a difficult, painful past, and a past which has until now been clothed in silence precisely because it's so difficult to talk about. Grandfather Speaks via audio recording. And the poem begins with 2 epigraphs. The first is by Maniza Alvi, which reads, "The family story, is it there for the taking? Is it mine for the taking?" And the second epigraph is by Urvashi Butalia, which reads, "Partition was surely more than just a political divide. It was also, to use a phrase that survivors use repeatedly, a division of hearts." Winter, 1952. 3 years, and stepping off the train, he'd forgotten the sting of the Bristolian wind. Having traversed seas and oceans, to ask my future grandmother for her hand in marriage. After months of airmail letters, her answer is already sealed. Back home, he'd had his work cut out, scything grasses, clearing jungle to make home and farm for his widowed mother, younger brother, and future wife. He speaks with pride of how he baked each brick, doesn't say why at 21 he had to start from mud when his father had been a surgeon. Doesn't mention the other family home abandoned overnight in that other country which had once been the same country. Doesn't say disjuncture, rupture, severance. Doesn't say trauma of body, mind, heart. Doesn't say Punjab. After all we have travelled, grandfather doesn't speak of the things he believes he's left behind and I've inherited. When a favourite poet says be shameless about your shame, he means this moment. He means me sitting with my grandfather's unspoken words in my ear and willing him to say them, though I know these words can never be spoken, not by him, speaking as he is from the other side of life.
Thank you. It strikes me hearing you read that and reading the collection as a whole is there's a kind of always a sort of moving back in some ways to a sort of some kind of origin. Where does it begin, or some kind of beginning, or even literally conception of a child, or you know, how things begin and how they repeat and how they unfold. And that seemed to me to be quite a strong movement in the poem. And I wondered whether you could say something about this sort of sense of home, you know, whether this sense of, does that conjure up in you a feeling of home? Even hearing him talking about those kind of things, does that generate a kind of a sense of beginnings, or where things begin?
I think this book is in many ways a search for home, a search for, the beginnings. And obviously, as this poem alludes to, there is a real sense of a lost home. So on my father's side, paternally, because of partition. And so having been completely, you know, ruptured from the home in Lahore before the divide. And so the book is really concerned with those cycles that you were talking about just there, Lesley, about the repercussions of, you know, intergenerational trauma, histories that we're all coming to grips with, and how we do have to revisit them to an extent in order to heal from them fully.
I was struck in your description on the Nine Arches blog, you talk about how the poem Inheritance came to be written, and you talk about how, although it describes the conception of a child, it could be describing the conception of another child. You know, it's not one fixed moment. That generation, the very nature of generation is quite repetitive, isn't it? That it gives birth to the next thing. But I was thinking about that as well through language, discovering new things through language. And I remember very clearly the excitement with which you discovered the poet Banu Kapil. I wonder if you could say a little about that. What was so important for you in that encounter? And is there a writer you've discovered recently who's provoked in you that same kind of excitement?
Yes, I vividly recall meeting you, I think, in St. James's Park, and we went to the Tate that day, and I just remember saying to you, I've discovered this writer, and this is the book, and this is the moment where it's poetry and there's no going back, and everything has changed now. And it did. It was this book, The Vertical Interrogation of Strangers by Banu Kapil.
Perhaps you'd like to read a little of something?
Yes, I will. Shall I go straight ahead and do that? Okay. So this book, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's almost like a long poem, but it's separated into different parts, different sections, each headed with one of 12 questions. And so the part that I'm going to read is part 49, and it starts with a question: who are you and whom do you love? A back room at the A1 Sweet Cafe on the South Hall Broadway. My father and I are drinking chai and eating chat while we wait for my mother to finish her grocery shopping at Dokal and Sons. We order extra onions and vinegar and eat without speaking. I am 16 years old. 9 or 10 years later, when I am walking through a redwood grove on the coast of Northern California, it is my father, eating steadily and ferociously in the semi-darkness of a dhaba in northwest London, who seems remote. The distances between my body and the bodies of the ones I love grow. They are limited by coasts. I have a few questions to ask, but I do not know how to break the growing silence. I breathe in the salty mist, walk back along the wild, shifting edge of everything. And in the middle of that, there was a sort of a paragraph break. So you may have noticed there was quite a shift. It was really difficult for me to choose actually a little section of it, which would really convey what the entirety of the book does, because it is so many things. And for me, I suppose the most exciting thing was, this prose poetry and this blurring of these genres that I've been working with. I've been working in prose, I've been working in poetry, and I think sometimes getting a bit frustrated with the rules of sometimes short stories in particular. I was like, oh, they feel a bit, especially when you're learning it at MA level, you feel there are some strong rules here, and I just want to break out of some of them. And same with poetry. And I feel like Barney Kapil does that. She breaks free of the rules of all genre, and she explores issues of. She also explores partition. There was a segment that I wanted to read about that, but it was really difficult choosing.
Yeah, I was listening to Barney Kapil talking to Meena Gorgi about her new collection Space. And they were talking about the different indoor and outdoor spaces in the poems and how differently these spaces are conceived of in different cultures. And it struck me that your collection feels very much like the work of a sensibility that's feeling out spaces and boundaries, and that it moves through alert atmospheres generated by skin on skin and voices, words, cloth and fabric, even hair. It's very tactile kind of sensibility that I found. So I was quite surprised to come upon your descriptions of Jamaica and the description of immersion in the elements. There's a poem, Blue Mountain, for example, where you describe this incredible immersion in these elements. Was Jamaica a very different geographic space for you to experience? Did that kind of change something for you?
Yes. Jamaica is the sort of the third big location in the book. So there's England, the Indian subcontinent, and Jamaica being the main settings of the book. And yes, I think Jamaica just sort of changed a lot for me. Yes, I feel like I'm still unpacking that. I feel like there are going to be more poems about Jamaica, because there are only a few in this collection. I think my focus was, I was trying to keep it to this conversation between India and England, and really trying to grapple with the history. So yes, I'm glad that you picked up on the Jamaica poems, but I wanted to weave them in because I wanted to show that there are many journeys, and it's also autobiographical, but I was keen to stick within the larger remit of the book, which is about movement. And it's about also resisting narratives. So Blue Mountain brings that in. And also, but it's also about, how porous boundaries can be now that we can travel so much, and how we can live anywhere. And so when you're moving around and when you're being, sort of nomadic, where do you belong and where is home? These are all the questions that I was asking.
Yeah, I was struck even that poem brings us at the end. It comes to the unmapped land colonist dared not enter. Much of your writing seems to be preoccupied with geographical borders and boundaries of language, difficulty of saying what we mean, and finding that that can also land in some kind of coherent cultural context that also
Yes.
has that supports our meaning as an individual within some bigger context.
Those were the bigger questions. It was, what separates us? And so I'm exploring, physical geographic distances and borders. And of course, I do also touch on Brexit and how, that border sort of, the EU and the UK, how that becomes an issue as well. I researched the origins of the modern rose and discover. But that was what I was interested in. I was interested in what divides us and how can we move beyond that. And so there are physical borders, and there are also metaphysical borders of, death and memory and time.
So thinking a little bit further about that sense of journeying, perhaps your journey from primers in 2016 to your first collection last month, and how your writing and its subjects has evolved. I'm also thinking of the influences that helped you to develop a sort of more theoretical approach as well, a more rigorous kind of philosophy, or a linguistic kind of political philosophy around what can and can't be said, and by whom, and where, and when, and all of that. And I think that was part of your experience of the Library Critics Programme. Is that right? Kind of exploring that
Yes.
sort of theoretical aspect.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more actually about Library Critics. Some people might not know what that is, how it was imagined and conceived, and how it developed your own thinking, kind of fed into your own poetry.
Absolutely. So the Ledbury Poetry Critics, for anyone who doesn't know, is a programme that was founded by Sandeep Parmar and Sarah Howe in 2017. And it was founded in order with the aim of diversifying British reviewing, and specifically British poetry reviewing. So there was in the UK and Ireland, even though it has now also expanded to the US as well. And that was just because there were statistics to show that British poetry reviewing was very, very white and also very male. We had lots of statistics to show that. And over the years, how the Ledbury Poetry Critics scheme works is you get paired up with a mentor at the start, and then you also are able to attend lots of workshops and to work on reviews, both with your mentor and in sort of peer review setting as well. And yes, so the Ledbury Poetry Critics helped my poetry immensely. I mean, just in terms of, technically, once you are paying such close attention to how other people's work is working, and when you're critiquing, that will, that inevitably enriches your own approach to your own writing as well. But then also we were having wider discussions about British poetry and what does it mean, and what is it, and exploring how we can bring our own sort of heritages to our writing as well. So yeah, it has really, really helped my work.
And bringing that kind of hybridity that you were talking about into the process of writing again. I imagine it's kind of quite a cross-cultural, even that group of people is quite a cross-cultural group, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another influence I was thinking about was or we might be interested to think about, is how you find time to write. I mean, your mother, working, doing a doctorate, you're busy, aren't you? You're a busy person. So I was wondering what you would have to say to someone who was sort of starting out or trying to manage a lifestyle or time that would support them, in making time, managing their energy. What are your top tips for someone who might be struggling to carve out those precious writing spaces?
Yeah, first off, I would say I see you. I think it's something that, so many of us struggle with. Motherhood is, an additional time. It's very time consuming. It takes up a lot of time, but, even people without children, there's work, there are caring responsibilities, perhaps of parents or others. I do think that we're really time poor in our society, and, especially with our focus on productivity and it has to be monetary. And so, there are lots of problems in our society at the moment. But as in terms of advice, I think that there's who is it who said that there's never going to be the right time. You know, if you're waiting for the right time to do something, that's never going to happen. You'll never do the thing. So I do think it's about trying to, you have to make that time. And as a mother, if you do have young children or if you have other caring responsibilities, it's about really trying to get some support and somebody to just watch the children, even if it's just for an hour, you know, once a week or something, carving that in. I know other people really advise, you know, getting up early and all of these things. I think you have to work with what works for you. I'm not an early riser. I have to say, I used to stay up very late at night. That was how I got a lot of my writing done, but I don't advise that either, because you get so tired. So it's just what works for you. But, you know, if it's important for you, you know, which it is. And I think writing was, you know, it has really grounded me during these difficult times when it's really hard to find time for yourself. It's just an immense relief to have writing, because it's this place where your imagination can roam, and it's just so grounding and important for your sense of self. So you do try to prioritize it, I think. Yeah,
I was also going to see you've also formed a collective, haven't you, with other people?
Yes.
Perhaps you might recommend to people to kind of find like-minded group.
That really helps. Yeah. So I think I wrote down 3 things here that I wanted to advise people. One was find like-minded people, have a collective, and then even if you're just checking in with these people once a month, it gets you back on track, I think. And you know, you've got the Red Door Poets, and I think collectives of like-minded writers really helps.
And what's your little thing that gets you, you know, when you're trying to finish something? So there you are. I mean, I'm not talking so much about time really, but that kind of emotional energy to kind of commit to finishing something, that finishing muscle. Is that something that you find challenging? Sometimes people have got a lot of sort of half-cooked projects, but it's sort of just tucking in all those last threads and finishing the seam that seems to be a challenge often, doesn't it?
That has been one of the my biggest challenge, I would say, because I have been writing for so many years, but I'm only just publishing my collection now, and you know, I'm almost 40, and I have been writing since I was a child, and on and off, you know, but I've always wanted to be a writer. So I think finishing was a big struggle for me, and I think the key thing there is just sending work out, because then you'll get the feedback from editors, you'll get the feedback from, you know, whether it's magazine editors or eventually editors of a pamphlet and then editors of the collection. And for me, that was how those threads started to get tied up, was through the help of either somebody else in a collective who can feed back to you, or an editor.
It's a mixture of the kind of tiny movements and then the big muscles, the kind of those two, the left hand, right hand kind of approach, keeping them both moving. That's really helpful to hear how you do that. So unfortunately we're really short on time here, and I'm just wondering if we have any questions. Mary, do we have any questions for Sarala?
Well, one's just come in from Dave Wakely. A question for Sarala: what is your relationship to your inner critic? And how do you keep the upper hand?
That's a really good question, and I was thinking about that as the one slight downfall of developing my critique, you know, the voice that started to critique other people's work, you know, very closely, and I had to be very careful to sort of turn that off when it came to my own work. It's really hard, isn't it? The inner critic is, you know, this beast that we all grapple with. I think that's where the courage comes in. I was trying to say about sending work out. I think, you know, you're going to have this inner critic, and this, you know, you're probably not going to want to show your work, but that's why it's important to have a collective, somebody to show your work who you trust. And then once you've fed that, you know, once you've had that feedback, then you could maybe develop the work further and then send it out again. And I think it's just, you have to trust your own instincts, and you also have to trust the feedback of other writers that you trust.
There's also a question that's just come in from Terry. How do you know when a poem is finished?
Yeah. How do you know? And is a poem ever finished as well? That's the other interesting thing, because, you know, even up until, you know, almost print, you know, I was still tinkering with some of those poems. So I would actually say a poem is never finished, but if you're happy and you're ready to let go of it, you know, it probably, you know, it needs to be out there in the world for other people to respond to, I think.
Fair enough. And now there's one from SK Grout. Sarah says, it sounds like you have a number of large scale topics that you want to approach and write about. So how do you manage that? Or do you wait to see which topic arrives first, or do you have a more ordered approach to it? Or do they sort of blend together somehow?
It's a really, really good question. And I'd say I frequently start with a personal, and because sometimes when I've tried to write about big issues, going sort of straight for those big issues, and they've really fallen really flat. So I need to have a personal connection, even if it's not necessarily my personal experience, but I need to have known somebody who has in some way grappled with that issue. And if you have a personal angle into that, that really helps. Also, using objects can really help as well. But just trying to deal with, you know, a small part of the big issue, not trying to tackle everything at once. And so I'd say, you know, each small poem does come together in the collection to deal with these larger issues together. Sometimes one poem can't do it all, so that's okay.
Yeah, brilliant. And then there's a question from Sia about experimenting with poetic form, because I mean, I know you've got the ghazal, say, and
Yes.
Then there was also in your book one that's particularly interests me, the camera lucida, which is a really interesting different form. I shall hold it up in case people haven't seen. I don't know if you can see that there, but it's a series of text boxes which are they sort of reflecting the camera image that you might get if you were trying to draw it? So perhaps you could say something about that.
That's a very interesting reading, Mary. So I'm happy to go for that. They were actually intended to look a bit like a photo album. So because the poem is dealing with photographs and going through my father's album after he'd passed, but it's also it has a very close relationship with Roland Barthes's text Camera Lucida, which meditates on photography and on grief. So it was working very closely with that poem, with that work. But you were talking about form, and form was something that I was really keen to experiment with. I was very inspired by Sarah Howe's Loop of Jade, in which she uses, you know, I think almost every poem is a different form. And I'm also sort of writing towards sort of mixed race identity and mixed heritage, and I'm really interested in fluidities of forms and trying out forms. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but in the collection we've got a ghazal, we've got we've got free verse, we've got a list poem. Yeah, I'm always trying out new forms because that's what excites me.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarala. Now back to Lesley.
Well, I was actually going to say I had lots of questions lined up on your use of the form, which we're really running against the clock here now. But there was one little thing I wanted to ask you about. In your Kanara interview, which you give in Poetry Birmingham. You talk about the contemporary British emphasis on the lyric mode to the exclusion of others. And I wondered what modes you felt were being excluded. Are these the kind of modes you're talking about? Or do you mean, I think British is quite a tricky word, isn't it? Anyway, the British lyric could be quite a few things. But I just wondered what you felt was missing, what's being excluded through an emphasis on the lyric mode. And what do you mean actually by where is this emphasis, do you find?
Yes, so I was responding there to Sandeep Parmar's essay in Threads, when I think it's called, Not a British Subject. And she was talking about, I think there has been such a change in recent years. I'd say over the last 10 years, there has been a real sort of flourishing of a diversity of voices, a diversity of forms that we're seeing. But actually, up until, not that long ago, it was very difficult for people to publish ghazals. Mona Arshi's spoken about that. She would submit some ghazals, this is about maybe 10 years ago, and the editors would say, oh, well, can we just change this? It's not very familiar to us. Can we get rid of, can we not call it ghazal, although traditionally they are called ghazals, and then you have potentially another subtitle, but they are called ghazals. All of those poems are called ghazals. And so there was, I'd say it's really changing now, but there was a resistance to other forms and modes, and also so the argument that Sandeep Parmar is really putting forward to, which resonated with me, is that there wasn't a plurality of voices and of cultural modes that were being published, but that is changing now, so which is really brilliant.
Yeah, because I also wanted to just very quickly ask you about, because you talked there about your own canons, how having the Kanara Collective created a space where you could you speak in your own voice and write from your own canons. And I wondered what you meant by those canons. What are those? Yes,
so absolutely. So I think actually that was also one of my tips to beginning writers or anybody who's trying to take their work further. I think it's really crucial to develop your own canon, because obviously we all know about the big English canon or the British canon that we're taught about at school and at university. But I think when you're studying those and they're not really reflecting your own life experiences, they can feel quite alienating, and you can sometimes think perhaps the subjects that you're interested in aren't publishable or aren't the material for literature with a capital L. So I think it's all about finding the work that resonates with you and developing your own canon, as well as, of course, appreciating what has come before, because that does deepen one's knowledge of the form as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of part of that hybridity, isn't it, that we kind of want to these mixtures, don't we? We don't want to start separating everything up too much.
Yeah. Continuity is good as well as disruption.
Oh, yeah. Evolution, revolution, yeah. So I was just to finish off, I think we probably have to wind up soon. It'd be really nice to carry on. But I was going to put you on a desert island, and actually it was going to be a deserted island so that you could have some peace and quiet. And first of all, I wondered where it would be. Where would your deserted island be? You've got some P&Q, notepad.
Oh, where would my island be? Oh, amazing. Somewhere warm, somewhere definitely very warm. Probably in the Caribbean somewhere.
Okay, and you can have one item of clothing, and you can have, in addition to what you're wearing, and one special thing to eat. What would you take with you?
So yes, so for the food, this would be predictably Indian, mango. I think I could live on mango, breakfast, lunch, dinner, mango is good for me. And an item of clothing would be a scarf, just because they keep my neck warm. I have a very sensitive neck, and I love scarves, and unfortunately, yeah.
Not have too many scarves. No.
Or perhaps a shawl, actually, because I don't know, it might get cooler in the evenings on my island. But it's somewhere warm. It has to be somewhere warm.
It might be hot. You might need to wrap it around your head to keep some.
Yes, multiple purpose, some shade as well.
Well, that was one of Keith's top tips, was to get dressed up before you sit down to write, to get you in the mood. So that would be a good thing to take with you, that you could ceremoniously get into the writing mode in your shawl.
Yeah, sounds good. I'd like to go to that.
Eat your mango and then for the peace and quiet. Well, thank you so much, Sarala. It's been really interesting to find out more about your process and your journey, and also to hear from your book. And perhaps you'd like to just finish off with a final poem for us. Would that be?
How are we doing for time? Do I need
time to do that, Mary? One poem?
Yeah, one. Not too long.
Right.
What poem?
The poem that I had selected might be a little bit long.
Although I'm sure it's fine if people don't mind hanging around. Just
think it's okay?
Yes.
I'll go with An Inheritance. And this poem is dedicated to Shivani Ramlo-Chan because both her work and her teaching really led to, gave me the courage to write this poem. An inheritance. A spirit hovered over the scene where the disobedience occurred. What kind of spirit? I couldn't tell, but it was there, trust me, as her lover leant over her sleeping body and pressed his lips to her neck and back, the crown of her silken, tangled head. Outside, the moon had risen and was slipping through the curtains as a spirit watched a woman turn her sleep-heavy body towards her lover, eyes still shut, as his hands touched, and her skin rose, and the moonlight slipped inside. A bedroom where there was no immaculate white, no unadulterated black. Tonight, there were only adulterations, quarterons of light and dark, variations on a variegated spectrum of in-betweens, and this released them. The spirit watched as they, man and woman, swam in infinite spectra of indefinition until they sank, and having sunk, resurfaced, gasped for breath, elation, the terrible orgasmic thrill of creation stroking their flanks, reverberating in their bones, the knowingness of cells, having made an image of themselves inside her. A miniature or photograph, proof of the breaking of unwritten rules of state, and above all, his parents' wishes. In that moment, the spirit upped and left, vanished into nothing, or maybe something. No one knows for certain, but I have an idea. You see, the image grew. It grew and grew until it had a mouth, nose, cheeks, and eyes with which to survey grandparents and state. And when the image was born, the story goes that through the tears of newborn wails, though it was impossible, the baby spirit child arose.